To start out tonight, I wanted to talk to you about this thing that I was reminded of this week, this experiment that took place in the 60s or 70s. I can't quite remember, but that span of time where just everyone was doing experiments, psychological experiments on people. This one was not one of the weird ones. This one was fun. It's called the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment. And basically, they would take a kid into a room, and they would sit them down at a table, and they would put a marshmallow in front of them, and they would say, "Hey, I'm going to leave for, I think it was 10 or 15 minutes. If I come back and you haven't eaten this marshmallow, you can have this one and you'll get another one. But if you have eaten it, that's it. That's all you get." And the kids split into like 3 different camps. The first camp, as soon as the person left, they would just kind of look at the marshmallow and just kind of look around, and they were like, "This is easy. I'll just wait and I'll get double prizes, no problem." I remember some of those kids growing up. They were boring. Anyway, then there was the other group of kids who would like watch for the person to leave, and then as soon as the door closed, just snatched it up. That thing was gone. My favorite group is the third group, who just struggled through the whole thing. The door would close, and some of them would just stare at the marshmallow. Some would just sit on their hands. Some started like rocking back and forth in their chair. At least one of the kids turned their chair around so they wouldn't have to look at the marshmallow, which is just a brilliant strategy. They said some kids got up and started pacing around, like staring at the marshmallow like, "Why would my parents put me in this situation?" And I can't remember the exact amount, but it was varying degrees of how far that group got before they would eat it. I think some held out to the end, but most of them at some point just gave in and ate the thing. And I love this experiment because I feel like it's a perfect snapshot with that inner tension that we all feel at times. This internal battle to not be controlled by our whims and desires. This experiment was looking at how powerful the idea of delayed gratification can be, but I think it also captures our struggle with gluttony, which is what we're talking about tonight. This is the 5th week of Lent. Lent is a season in the church calendar in which we create space to encounter God. As we've been saying every week, we do this by giving up or taking up. Giving up what can distract us to create space for us to hear and respond to God, and taking up practices to help realign us and ground us and increase our attention to his voice. Our hope is that together as a community, from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday, we will be more intentional in creating space and encountering God, our Father. This year, we're specifically engaging in Lent through the lens of finding rest for our souls, based on what Jesus says in Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So we've been spending Lent talking about the things that prevent us from finding this kind of rest, as those are the things that tend to prevent us from connecting to God. So we've talked about perfectionism, worry, apathy. Last week we talked about busyness. This week we're talking about gluttony. Gluttony. Though it's not something that we talk about a lot, gluttony is pervasive within our culture. And it's like kind of a fun word to say, but doesn't sound good, if that makes any sense. It's like very never mind. What is it? What is gluttony? According to the dictionary, gluttony is overindulgence or overconsumption of food, drink, or wealth items. Intemperance. I don't know what a wealth item is. I think I would probably love to find out, but I think you get the idea. What do you think of when you think about gluttony? I always immediately think of this old ad that's just seared into my brain. This was in the early 90s. It's an ad for Super Mario World 2, which I think was called Yoshi's Island. Yes, it's Yoshi's Island. And this ad actually got banned But my family used to record movies that were shown on TV on VHS, and so we didn't skip the commercials. So my childhood is just watching 80s and 90s commercials in the middle of the movies that I was trying to see. So I saw this ad over and over and over again. I'll try to be fast about this. It's the scene of this large man in a restaurant, at like the back of the restaurant, and he's just like consuming food like crazy. And the voiceover is like, we've crammed so much in this game, you don't think anything else can fit. I don't know why they thought this idea was a good idea. But so the guy's just eating more and more food. It's like chicken and Jell-O and mashed potatoes. Every time they show him, he's getting bigger and bigger. At one point, like his belt breaks and then like his shirt buttons all fly off. And then he says, like with his mouth full of mashed potatoes, like, I'm all done or something like that, like no more. And then the voiceover says, don't you think you could fit like just a tiny bit more? And he looks at his finger and it's like covered in whipped cream and he's like, yeah, well, why wouldn't I? I mean, after all this. So he just like gets the little bit of whipped cream and then all of a sudden his eyes get really big and there's this like rumbling and everyone else in the restaurant starts looking around and then he explodes all over everyone. Everyone's screaming. It shows like 5 different things like people getting hit. This is not a cartoon. This was like real life people. It was so gross. And that's why it got banned, because it was very disturbing for kids. And then it shows like fun, images from like the game, the Nintendo game. I don't know. But that idea is just, anytime I think of gluttony, I see this ad playing in my mind. You might think of a similar image. Hopefully not that exact one. Maybe your childhood was better than mine. But it's usually someone way overindulging with food or drink. But gluttony isn't just about food. Another definition of gluttony is confusing feeling good and being good. It's privileging feelings above reality. So gluttony says as long as you feel good, you are good. Last week we talked about how apathy was about avoiding our lives through busyness was about avoiding our lives through constant distraction. Gluttony is about escaping them through consumption and indulgence and through seeking pleasure. Gluttony looks a lot more like being controlled than being in control. Gluttony is addiction to anything, to food, to drugs, to alcohol, to sex, to approval, to affirmation, to work, to Netflix. We call it binge watching for a reason. Gluttony is about consuming at all costs, just to keep consuming, because when you consume, you feel good. And if you feel good, you are good, which just sounds so much like our culture, which is, I think, part of why we don't talk about this very much. The reality is, if you don't have the ability to say no or enough to something, then you don't actually have the ability to enjoy that thing anymore. And you've become a slave to it. I remember back before I had tiny people to keep alive, I would sit down to like watch an episode on Netflix. And before I knew it, like 5 or 6 episodes had gone by. And I would think like, why am I still watching this? Maybe you have ran into that situation, or you think like, why am I still eating or drinking? Why am I going back for more? Like I'm not even hungry anymore. What am I doing? I sometimes still will catch myself like with the fridge open, like staring into the fridge for something to eat, and I'm not even hungry. I just want to consume something. Why am I still scrolling and scrolling and scrolling on my phone? The joy of these things the joy of these things that may have at one time offered comfort, and maybe have possibly been a part of finding rest for our souls, the joy of them has been lost. Gluttony is handing over joy and freedom to momentary and fleeting pleasure and escape. Gluttony is signing up for an endless chase of pleasure that only costs your life. Proverbs has some pretty clear and punchy things to say about this. The first is in Proverbs 25, which is, this is just such a good, I love this so much. If you find honey, eat just enough of it. Too much of it and you will vomit. Next time someone tells you that the Bible isn't relevant or has nothing to say to us today, you whip out Proverbs 25:16, and then ask them what happens if they eat too much honey. It's wisdom. Proverbs 21:17, you're addicted to thrills? What an empty life. The pursuit of pleasure is never satisfied. Chapter 23, verses 19 through 21. Oh, listen, dear child, become wise. Point your life in the right direction. Don't drink too much wine and get drunk. Don't eat too much food and get fat. Drunks and gluttons will end up on Skid Row in a stupor and dressed in rags. Gluttony steals your joy and your freedom and your life. And there's nothing more miserable than missing out on what we've been created to do and to be because of our gluttonous hearts. It's really hard to be who you've been created to be when you're so focused on just taking more and more and more and feeling good. How difficult it is for you to feel any sort of deep sense of rest for your soul or any deep sense of connection to God when you've handed over your freedom, when you're focused on consuming and numbing out and escaping, when you're so focused on feeling good, when you're stuck trying to satisfy an insatiable hunger. Paul addresses this idea directly, writing to the Christians in a place called Corinth, who, as a community, really struggled with gluttony. In 1 Corinthians 6, Paul addresses a slogan that the church has adopted to justify their gluttony. He says, quoting them, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. I have the right to indulge in anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. Yes, we are free. You are free. But Paul is saying, don't use your freedom to become slaves to something else. The Message version of this passage, I think, also captures the idea really well. It says, just because something is technically legal doesn't mean that it's spiritually appropriate. If I went around doing whatever I thought I could get away with, I'd be a slave to my whims. This idea is echoed in other places in the New Testament, like Galatians 5:1, which says, Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let anyone put a harness of slavery on you. Don't squander your freedom by willingly giving it away, especially to the pursuit of empty, fleeting pleasure. As human beings, we're created and called to greatness. We're called to be free, to be able to say no to our desires, so that we can say yes to joy and to freedom, so that we can say yes to feasting and celebrating, so that we can say yes to receiving rest for our souls. Gluttony prevents us from doing any of those things. So how do we address this? How do we begin to give up gluttony? Gluttony's hold on us. First, I think when we talk about this, there's sort of a spectrum to gluttony, I think. On the one end, there's sort of like the mindless, unintentional things that creep into our lives, things that we didn't really pursue, things that just kind of like creep up into culture that next thing you know, you're spending 18 hours a week on it, but it's not like, you're not seeking this out initially, it just sort of creeps its way in. That's on one side. And then on the complete opposite side of the spectrum is what we would call full-blown addiction. And so we're going to talk about practices that hit different points along that spectrum. So the first practice to begin giving up gluttony in our lives, I think, is sort of a simple one in theory, but I think in practice it's challenging. The first is just shift your perspective. In 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul writes, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. I think if we can shift our perspective to have this in the back of our minds more, and even the question of how can I glorify God in this with whatever we're doing or consuming, that will help us begin to be more mindful about what we're actually doing with our time and with our lives. I think it also opens us up to a deeper connection with God, which is ultimately what we're after, when we start to realize that everything we do becomes a potential act of worship. Everything that we do is potentially a way to glorify God. So simply changing our posture a little bit and asking, looking for the ways to glorify God in the things that we consume and enjoy will help us to be more intentional about them and more mindful of what's going on. The second thing is set boundaries. This seems so simple, right? Like many of the things we've been talking about, it's almost insultingly simple. But it's usually the thing that we overlook, which is how we wind up binging, right? It's a really simple concept. If I sit down to watch a show at the end of the day with my wife and I grab a bag of Lay's barbecue chips, the most perfect chip ever created on the planet, if I bring the whole bag with me, I'm going to eat a lot, like a whole lot. But if I just grab a handful of chips and like put them in a bowl, like even like a big handful, right? Like it's fine. I want to have some chips. I'm going to eat less because I just set that boundary. And I'm going to feel just as satisfied. It's going to be great. I'm going to have a great time. Set boundaries ahead of time to take control of what's enough. It's just about being intentional ahead of time and taking control. It feels elementary sometimes, but like even like all of our phones now have things that you can set timers on different apps. I've got so many timers on this phone now to try to keep me from unintentionally wasting my day, that every time they go off, I feel kind of silly, but I'm also like, okay, good, that's enough, I'm done. And I don't accidentally waste hours and hours simply because I've set that boundary ahead of time. So shift your perspective, set boundaries. The third is practice Sabbath. And this is going to look a little bit different than what we've been talking about the previous weeks of practicing Sabbath. This is a 3-step kind of idea. The first is just choose a day to abstain or fast from whatever it is, whatever the thing is that you are struggling with. In addition to that, work up to spending an hour in stillness and silence. This might not be for the reason that you think. This is so that you can learn to be bored again. In a culture that is so overindulgent with entertainment, to your brain, boredom feels like death. So many issues of gluttony develop as a way of just us to escape our boredom. Like I was saying earlier, I stand in front of the fridge wanting to eat something because I'm bored, not because I'm hungry. We need to reprogram our brains to learn to be bored again. It's not a bad thing. In fact, boredom is often what leads to our deepest insights and our best innovations and our most creative acts. Learn to be bored again. You might look like that third group in the marshmallow experiment, just like rocking back and forth and pacing, just being like, what is happening? Why is this happening to me? But intentionally work some boredom back into your life. And then spend some time doing something that you enjoy that's outside of your current ordinary. Boredom is a good thing. Stagnation isn't. Shake up your routines. Get back into reading. Get your body moving. Go hiking, write, play, live. Like do something that you know you enjoy that you're not doing now. Sabbath gives you permission and space to do these things. And then lastly, again, this is going to seem obvious, but as a recovering addict myself, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this. Like on the other end of the spectrum, if you tonight are addicted to something, you need to confront that. If you are caught in the cycle of addiction, hearing someone say, just set boundaries, is the most infuriating and depressing thing. I know, I have been there. Like, okay, guy, yeah. If all it took for you to get healthy or clean was just choosing to say no, you would have done it by now. But here's the truth. It's still your choice to stay in your addiction or to find freedom. So, practicing giving up gluttony for you, it doesn't look like just saying no and choosing to not indulge. Instead, for you, it looks like saying no to your addiction's continued control over your life by choosing to get help, by revealing your struggles to people closest to you and asking for help. I know, this is a lot easier to say than do. Similar to what we talked about with apathy. To address this, you're going to have to do the very, very last thing that you want to do, the thing that you're most terrified to do, the thing that you've come to believe you couldn't possibly do, which is be honest and ask for help. It is really hard, but you're strong enough to do it, and your life is worth it. And you will look back and wonder, what took me so long? I'm happy to walk with you through that process, through your addiction. I still fight mine every day, but it doesn't run my life. If I can do that, every single person in this room absolutely can. I'm happy to listen to you and to help connect you to counselors, whatever help you need in order to be free. We have a grace fund around here. If counseling is too expensive for you, we can help with that to some degree. Talk to me. You were created for greatness. You were created to be free. So take back your freedom. Do it starting tonight, starting this week, starting this spring season. It's the first day of spring. This could be the first day of the end of your addiction. It's a beautiful time to start the rest of your life. So, to recap, gluttony is this insatiable force that steals our joy and our freedom. It steals our very lives in exchange for momentary fleeting pleasures. What is ruling you? Will you continue to be ruled, or will you grab hold of freedom, the freedom that you are called to, the freedom that you deserve? Will you continue to be weary and burdened, or will you find rest for your soul? That choice is yours. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Let's pray. God, thank you that you are bigger than the things we sometimes lose ourselves to and lose ourselves in. God, you are bigger than any of the things that take control of our lives, whether it's just mindless, unintentional things that have creeped into our lives, or if it's a full-blown addiction that we're struggling with. God, thank you that you don't abandon us to those things, that you're not ashamed of us because of those things, but that you are standing with us in those things, ready to deliver us from them. God, I pray that anyone in this room tonight, or anyone hearing my voice who is struggling with addiction, will get that extra boost of courage to finally take their lives back, to start that painful but so rewarding process of finding their freedom again and giving up the gluttony that has taken over. God, thank you for your loving grace that makes that possible. And thank you for a community of people who don't shy away from the difficult and dark parts of life, but that walk through the valley of the shadow of death with one another. We love you, God. Amen.